The year is 1942 and the world is on fire. Across Europe and the Pacific, battlefields thunder with artillery, skies rumble with engines, and oceans churn with fleets locked in deadly pursuit. But thousands of miles away, in the heart of the United States, another kind of battlefield is taking shape. Step inside a factory floor in Detroit or Pittsburgh, and you will not hear gunfire or explosions. Instead, the sound is a steady roar of machines, the clang of steel against steel, and the constant rhythm of human labor. Here in these vast industrial halls, America's war effort begins. Imagine the scene: long lines of workers, men and women alike, their faces streaked with sweat and grease as they guide sheets of glowing steel into massive presses. Sparks fly with every hammer strike, filling the air with the sharp scent of hot metal. Rubber is poured, stretched, and molded into the tires that will carry tanks across deserts and jungles. These are not the glamorous images of soldiers charging into battle, but they are just as vital. Every bolt tightened and every wheel assembled brings the war effort one step closer to victory. The transformation of these factories was sudden and absolute. Just months before, these same workers had been building cars, stoves, and refrigerators for a growing middle class. Advertisements promised comfort, leisure, and convenience, while showroom floors glittered with polished chrome. Yet now those luxuries had vanished almost overnight. Instead of stylish sedans, assembly lines churned out armored vehicles. Instead of sleek refrigerators, factories stamped out artillery shells by the thousands. The speed of this change shocked the nation, but it also inspired awe. America had turned its consumer culture into an arsenal of war. This industrial metamorphosis carried with it an undeniable sense of urgency. Newsreels shown in theaters depicted burning cities in Europe and advancing enemy forces in Asia. Families watched these images and understood that the stakes were nothing less than survival. Workers felt that same urgency inside the factory walls. Every machine running at full capacity meant more supplies for soldiers overseas. Every shift completed meant lives saved at the front. The sense of duty was overwhelming, and it pushed Americans to endure long hours and grueling conditions with determination. Factories were no longer just workplaces. They became symbols of unity, strength, and sacrifice. Walking into one was like entering a temple of industry, where every movement of the assembly line carried the weight of national destiny. Managers barked orders, engineers scrambled to solve bottlenecks, and workers adapted to unfamiliar machines with remarkable speed. There was no time for hesitation. The war demanded total commitment, and the American people answered. In these opening moments of transformation, the seeds of victory were planted not on distant shores, but in the heart of America's industrial cities. To step outside those factories was to step into a nation in transition. Billboards and posters reminded everyone of their role in the war effort, urging citizens to conserve materials and buy war bonds. Newspapers reported daily on production numbers as if they were battle reports, celebrating milestones like tanks rolling off the line or planes completing their test flights. The language of war had entered every corner of American life, and nowhere was it clearer than inside the factories. They were no longer just places of work. They were battlefields in their own right, where the weapons of victory were forged from rubber and steel. For the workers themselves, the atmosphere was a mix of exhaustion and pride. Many knew friends and family who were already overseas, fighting in conditions they could only imagine. Each finished product felt like a personal contribution to their survival. A rifle, a truck, or a bomber was not just a number in a ledger. It was a lifeline to someone's son, husband, or brother. That knowledge gave every task meaning, no matter how repetitive or difficult. The war was fought with courage on the front lines, but also with resolve on the factory floor. As the first months of wartime production rolled forward, the United States found its rhythm. Factories that had once been hesitant now surged with energy. Mistakes were corrected, new techniques refined, and the flow of war materials began to accelerate. It was the beginning of a story that would reshape the course of history. The roar of the factory floor, the glow of molten steel, and the hum of endless labor would become the soundtrack of America's entry into the greatest conflict the world had ever known. This was the opening chapter, and it set the stage for a transformation that would prove decisive in the years to come. The sudden transformation of America's factories was not without its struggles. Beneath the impressive headlines of rising production and patriotic resolve, there was a harsher truth. The lifeblood of industry, the very materials that made war machines possible, was running thin. Rubber and steel, once so abundant that they fed a booming consumer economy, had become scarce and precious. What was once taken for granted was now rationed and carefully guarded. This tension between abundance and scarcity shaped the very heart of the war effort. Imagine standing at the edge of a factory floor where hundreds of tires are meant to be rolling off the line each day. Instead of the familiar smell of natural rubber, there is frustration, hesitation, and uncertainty. With trade routes disrupted and supplies cut off, factories turned to experimental synthetic alternatives. Workers who once could count on steady shipments of raw materials now had to wait anxiously for each delivery, knowing that shortages could halt the entire line. The contrast was striking. What had once been a smooth process of mass production was now a battle against time and limited resources. Steel posed an equally daunting challenge. For decades, it had been the backbone of America's growth, shaping skyscrapers that pierced the sky and bridges that spanned mighty rivers. Now steel was stripped from civilian projects and redirected to war. Construction halted. Civilian industry shrank. The very symbol of progress had been torn from daily life and repurposed for tanks, bombers, and ships. Families watched as new building projects were abandoned and car dealerships emptied, replaced by the knowledge that every ton of steel was now a weapon in waiting. The shift was dramatic, and it left no part of society untouched. The contrast extended beyond material shortages. Workers themselves faced the weight of change. Long hours grew longer and demands became harsher. Men who once took pride in crafting sleek consumer goods now found themselves producing instruments of destruction. Women, many entering the workforce for the first time, learned to handle heavy machinery and precision tools. The transition was not just mechanical, it was personal. The comfortable rhythm of civilian life had been replaced by the grinding urgency of war. Every face told the same story of sacrifice, determination, and exhaustion. Factories themselves bore the scars of this transformation. Machines designed for peaceful production were pushed to their limits, sometimes breaking under the stress of their new purpose. Floors were crowded with hastily added equipment, aisles filled with raw materials piled high in chaotic stacks. The air was thicker with smoke, the noise more relentless, the pressure more unyielding. What had once been spaces of innovation and efficiency became crucibles of survival. In the relentless clamor of steel presses and rubber molds, one could feel the tension of a nation struggling to balance need against shortage. Yet even in this struggle, there was a grim sense of pride. Workers knew that every compromise, every shortage overcome, was part of something larger. They accepted the rationing of tires for their own cars, the absence of new appliances in their homes, and the constant calls for sacrifice. It was a daily reminder of the vast difference between peace and war. In peacetime, rubber and steel built comfort, luxury, and progress. In wartime, those same materials became the bones and sinews of survival. The contrast could not have been sharper, and it underscored the true cost of America's transformation into an arsenal of victory. The challenges of scarcity and sacrifice did not weaken the war effort, they hardened it. The shortages forced innovation, discipline, and resolve. They taught workers and managers alike that success would not come easily, but it would come through endurance. Out of this crucible of contrast, America began to learn the hard lessons that would sustain it through the darkest years of war. This was not just a story of production, but of transformation under pressure. It was a reminder that victory was born not only in abundance, but in the struggle to overcome scarcity. Long before the thunder of war reached America's shores, its factories had already mastered a unique rhythm. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the nation had perfected the art of mass production. Rows of assembly lines stretched across cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago, producing automobiles, radios, refrigerators, and other symbols of modern life. The hum of machinery was steady, and the purpose was clear: to feed the appetite of a growing middle class. People bought new cars to drive the expanding highways, new appliances to fill their kitchens, and new comforts that defined the American dream. Industry was not only about profit, it was about progress. This foundation of efficiency and repetition would prove vital when war came. The same assembly lines that once polished chrome for stylish sedans were quickly retooled to churn out armored vehicles. The molds that had stamped out refrigerator doors now stamped out artillery shells. Engineers and foremen who had perfected consumer goods applied their skills to weapons of war. The transition was not easy, but the framework already existed. America's vast industrial machine had been built for prosperity, and with remarkable speed, it was redirected toward survival. For the workers, this shift was both startling and deeply personal. A man who once took pride in finishing a gleaming Buick now stood at a bench assembling parts for military trucks. A woman who had never imagined herself in a factory before the war found herself working with precision tools to build bomber components. The factories became schools of adaptation, where old skills were reshaped and new ones acquired. The transformation was not abstract. It was visible every day in the products rolling off the line and in the faces of those who made them. The government's call to industry was clear, and it was relentless. Civilian production was halted or restricted, and contracts were redirected to serve the military. Factories signed agreements not with retailers, but with the War Department. The goals were staggering: tens of thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of trucks, and bombers built in numbers unimaginable before. The origins of this effort were rooted not in political speeches or military strategy alone, but in the deep industrial base already present in America. Without those decades of practice in mass production, the shift would have been impossible. Behind the machines, the workers carried the weight of responsibility. They understood that what they built would not stay on the factory floor. A rifle was not just a product. It was a weapon that would be carried into battle by someone's brother, father, or son. A truck was not just a vehicle. It was a lifeline that would carry food, medicine, and ammunition to the front. Every finished product had a story waiting to unfold thousands of miles away. This connection gave meaning to the long hours and grueling pace of work. The origins of wartime industry were not just technical, they were emotional. The speed of adaptation was itself remarkable. Within months, companies that had never built a single weapon were producing them in astonishing quantities. Tire manufacturers became experts in synthetic rubber. Automakers became specialists in military vehicles. Appliance companies found themselves producing shell casings and aircraft parts. This was not simply a matter of retooling machines, it was a reinvention of purpose. Industry had always been about serving the nation's needs, but now those needs were defined by war. In these early origins, one truth became clear: America's factories were not only capable of change, they were capable of transformation on a scale unmatched in history. The years of producing consumer goods had laid the foundation. The war gave those skills a new direction. Out of the hum of peaceful industry emerged the roar of wartime production. The story of origins was not just about machines and assembly lines. It was about the people and the traditions of work that turned rubber and steel into the weapons of victory. On the front lines of World War II, the results of America's industrial transformation became immediately visible. Soldiers stepping into jeeps or trucks knew that each vehicle had been assembled in Detroit, Chicago, or some other American city. The rubber in their tires might once have been destined for a family car, but now it carried them across deserts, jungles, and muddy fields. The steel plating of their tanks and armored carriers was forged from the same mills that had once built skyscrapers. Every piece of equipment was a tangible link between the home front and the battlefield, a reminder that victory depended not only on courage but on production. Imagine being a young soldier far from home, climbing into a jeep that smelled of fresh rubber and machine oil. The engine roared to life with the confidence of a well-oiled machine, its parts meticulously tested and assembled. For that soldier, the jeep was not just transport, it was survival. It carried rations to hungry units, ammunition to frontline positions, and wounded comrades back to safety. Behind the wheel, many soldiers could sense that the strength of American industry was moving alongside them, turning the tide of war mile by mile. The skies told the same story. Bombers and fighter planes, their bodies shaped from endless tons of American steel, dominated the air. Pilots trusted in the precision of their machines, built by hands that had never left the factory floor. The roar of engines above battlefields was the echo of assembly lines running day and night back home. For every formation of bombers overhead, thousands of workers had labored without rest to ensure they reached the skies. The impact was not only in firepower but in morale. Soldiers believed that they were supported by an unbreakable chain of production that stretched from their rifles to their rations. The supplies reached beyond vehicles and planes. Weapons, uniforms, helmets, and even boots carried the imprint of American factories. A rifle might feel heavy in a soldier's hands, but it was a weight that brought confidence. Ammunition boxes, stamped with the marks of American steel, offered reassurance that there would be no shortage of firepower in the heat of combat. Even small comforts like canned food or medical supplies bore the signature of the industrial effort. The battlefield was saturated with evidence of the home front's labor, each item a silent companion to those fighting far from home. For commanders, the effect was strategic as well as psychological. They could plan operations with the assurance that supplies would arrive, often in overwhelming numbers. This reliability allowed them to push offensives, sustain long campaigns, and maintain pressure on the enemy. Where other nations struggled with shortages and broken supply lines, American forces advanced with confidence. It was not just bravery or tactics that secured victories, but the steady heartbeat of production. The battlefield became the stage where the hidden power of factories revealed itself most clearly. The enemy, too, felt the weight of this industrial might. German and Japanese soldiers faced not only determined opponents, but also an opponent with seemingly endless resources. Tanks rolled forward, aircraft darkened the skies, and supply lines seemed unbroken. Each advance reminded them that they were not just fighting men, they were fighting machines that flowed endlessly from across the ocean. The psychological effect was devastating. The battlefield, once measured in courage and numbers alone, was now measured in steel, rubber, and the relentless rhythm of American industry. In every theater of war, from the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific, the connection was clear. America's factories were not distant, abstract forces. They were present in every bolt, every weapon, and every vehicle that entered the fray. Soldiers carried them, rode them, and trusted them. The battlefield was the proving ground of industry, and with each victory, it became clearer that rubber and steel were as decisive as bullets and bombs. The impact was undeniable. American production had become a weapon in itself, shaping not only battles, but the entire course of the war. The transformation of American factories did not stop at the battlefront. Its effects rippled outward, shaping every aspect of civilian life back home. Families who once enjoyed the freedom of new cars and household appliances suddenly found themselves living with ration books and shortages. Tires were no longer easy to replace, gasoline was rationed, and the idea of buying a new car became unthinkable. Kitchens that might have welcomed shiny new refrigerators or radios now carried the quiet absence of consumer goods. The home front had been pulled into the war effort, and daily sacrifice became part of life. The rationing of materials was not only a logistical necessity, it was a cultural shift. Posters on city streets urged families to conserve rubber, collect scrap metal, and save cooking grease, reminding them that every bit of effort mattered. School children carried bundles of scrap paper and cans to collection drives. Housewives learned to stretch meals further and to make do with fewer luxuries. Each act, however small, was framed as part of the greater fight. The lines between civilian and soldier blurred, as every person was told that they too were part of the struggle for victory. Businesses felt the change with equal force. Companies that had once thrived on consumer markets were redefined by wartime contracts. Automakers turned entirely to military vehicles, while manufacturers of household goods shifted to producing shell casings or aircraft parts. Profit was no longer measured in sales to households, but in output for the military. Factories became symbols of national duty rather than consumer success. Entire industries learned that survival in wartime meant abandoning comfort and convenience in favor of sacrifice and service. This redefinition of purpose reshaped the economy as profoundly as it reshaped the battlefield. Communities, too, bore the strain of transformation. Streets that once bustled with deliveries of new products now pulsed with the comings and goings of workers heading to long shifts. Cities grew louder and dirtier as factories ran day and night, producing smoke and noise without pause. Families endured the absence of fathers, brothers, and sons who had gone off to fight, while mothers and daughters filled their places in the factories. The balance of daily life was disrupted, yet pride ran deep. Neighbors encouraged each other, and local newspapers celebrated production milestones as if they were battlefield victories. For many, the hardships of shortages became badges of honor. A mother might walk for miles to save gasoline, and she did so, knowing her sacrifice helped supply soldiers overseas. A worker might endure a grueling double shift, comforted by the thought that every vehicle assembled meant one more step toward victory. The nation accepted rationing and scarcity not with resignation, but with determination. Hardship became proof of unity. The wider consequence of war production was not just economic or material, it was emotional. It bound the nation together with a sense of common purpose that few had felt before. This unity carried a powerful psychological effect. Families on the home front felt directly connected to soldiers overseas, not only through letters, but through the products they helped create. A woman riveting steel in a factory could look at a photograph of soldiers and know that her hands had built the plane that flew above them. A schoolboy collecting scrap metal could imagine that the very pieces he gathered might one day form a tank rolling across enemy lines. The war effort was no longer distant or abstract. It lived in the factories, the kitchens, the classrooms, and the streets of America. In this way, the wider consequences of factory transformation reached beyond production numbers and battle statistics. They changed the fabric of American society itself. The war redefined values, placing duty above comfort and unity above personal gain. Citizens learned that their sacrifices were essential, and they embraced this truth with resilience. The home front became inseparable from the front lines, linked by the flow of rubber, steel, and unyielding determination. America had turned itself into an arsenal not just of weapons, but of collective will, and that unity would prove as powerful as any tank or bomber sent into battle. By the middle years of the war, America's industrial transformation reached its peak. Factories that had once hesitated in the early months now operated with relentless precision. Day and night, the thunder of machines never ceased. Entire cities pulsed with the sound of production, their skylines glowing with the light of furnaces and smokestacks. Workers endured shifts that stretched deep into the night, knowing that every hour counted. The demand was overwhelming, but the response was greater still. It was here, at this fever pitch of effort, that the arsenal of democracy revealed its full power. Inside the factories, the pressure was immense. Conveyor belts moved faster than ever before, machines strained at their limits, and workers pushed their bodies to exhaustion. Mistakes could not be afforded, for the pace of production left little room for error. Supervisors paced the floor, clipboards in hand, counting every rifle, every tire, every piece of steel armor, as if each number was a measure of survival itself. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and smoke, while the clamor of steel striking steel shook the very walls. Yet within this chaos, there was a rhythm, a shared understanding that every sacrifice mattered. The results were staggering. Warships slid down American shipyards in record time, bombers rolled off assembly lines faster than pilots could be trained, and tanks emerged in quantities that dwarfed enemy production. Soldiers at the front began to speak of the endless supplies arriving in convoys, trucks stacked with crates of ammunition, vehicles, and rations. The very sight of these shipments was enough to lift morale. It reassured them that they would never fight alone, that a nation stood behind them, armed not with rifles, but with an ocean of supplies. The factories had become the hidden armies of the war, fighting not with bullets, but with output. The climax was not only about numbers, it was about impact. The tide of war began to shift as American industry delivered more than the enemy could destroy. Each campaign became a demonstration of production power. Tanks rolled in endless columns, planes filled the skies, and supply lines never faltered. Commanders planned with the confidence that reinforcements would arrive, that shortages would not hold them back. The factory floor, thousands of miles away, had become a weapon as powerful as any division of soldiers. In this moment, production itself was victory, but the climax also carried human cost. Workers collapsed from exhaustion, families endured long absences, and cities groaned under the strain of non-stop labor. The glory of numbers concealed the weariness of those who made them possible. Yet, despite fatigue and sacrifice, the spirit of unity held firm. Every tired hand gripping a tool, every sleepless night beside a machine was offered willingly. The nation understood that the price of victory was high, but that it had to be paid. The peak of production was not only a triumph of machines, it was a triumph of human will. For the enemy, the sight of America's industrial surge was devastating. German and Japanese leaders had underestimated the scale of American industry, imagining that distance and inexperience would slow its response. Instead, they watched as factories flooded the world with tanks, planes, and ships in numbers impossible to match. The balance of war tilted visibly, and the confidence of Axis forces began to erode. They realized they were not fighting one army, but an entire nation that had transformed itself into a vast war machine. The climax of American production became a turning point, a moment when the possibility of Allied victory grew undeniable. In these years of peak effort, America proved what it had promised at the beginning of the war. The arsenal of democracy was not just rhetoric, it was reality. The roar of industry drowned out doubt, the flow of supplies sustained the fight, and the unity of the home front carried the nation forward. This was the high point of America's wartime transformation, when factories reached beyond their walls and shaped the very outcome of battles. In the crucible of exhaustion and determination, victory began to take form. The climax had arrived, and with it, the certainty that the war could be won. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the echoes of American factories still lingered. The same machines that had stamped out tanks and bombers now sat still, their noise replaced by an uneasy quiet. Workers who had given years of sweat and strength looked at the assembly lines and understood what they had accomplished. They had not only fueled victory, they had reshaped the very idea of what industry could achieve. The war was over, but its industrial legacy had only just begun. The return to peace was not immediate or simple. Factories shifted slowly back to civilian production, and workers adjusted to building cars, refrigerators, and appliances once more. Yet the skills they carried, the discipline they had forged, and the unity they had discovered did not vanish. The nation had proven that it could mobilize its economy at a scale unmatched in history. The knowledge of that strength and the pride of that accomplishment remained a part of every worker who had lived through it. The industrial victory was not forgotten, even as consumer goods once again filled store shelves. Communities carried scars and memories of the years of sacrifice. Families remembered rationing, shortages, and long hours of work, but they also remembered the pride of contribution. Cities that had once been ordinary industrial centers now bore the identity of arsenals, proud of the role they had played in the global fight. The war had left them with more than economic growth. It had given them a sense of purpose, a proof that their labor could change the course of history. The legacy of the factories was not only measured in steel and rubber, but in the spirit of unity they inspired. For the soldiers who had fought overseas, the connection to home was never forgotten. They carried jeeps across deserts, tanks through forests, and bombers across skies, always aware that behind each machine was the unseen hand of a worker in America. Veterans returned home with gratitude, knowing that their survival was made possible not only by comrades on the battlefield, but by millions of citizens at home. This bond between the front line and the factory floor became one of the most enduring memories of the war. It was proof that victory belonged to both the soldier and the laborer. Internationally, the legacy was even more profound. America emerged from the war with unmatched industrial capacity, standing as a symbol of strength in a world struggling to rebuild. The ability to transform rubber and steel into weapons of victory had marked the nation as a global leader. Allies looked to American factories with admiration, while former enemies acknowledged their decisive role. The war had proven that industry could be as powerful a weapon as any army. That truth would shape not only the immediate post-war years, but the entire balance of the modern world. The closing chapter of America's wartime production was not an ending, but a foundation for the future. The innovations developed, the resilience tested, and the unity forged became part of the nation's identity. The lessons of sacrifice and cooperation lingered, reminding generations that the strength of a nation lay not only in its weapons, but in its people's ability to adapt and endure. The factories had been more than places of work. They had been the crucibles of victory. The story of rubber and steel was at its heart the story of resilience. It was about ordinary men and women who turned their labor into lifelines, who transformed raw materials into instruments of hope and survival. It was about a nation that discovered its true strength not only in battle, but in the steady hum of machines and the steady hands of workers. In the crucible of war, America's factory floor had proven itself as vital as any battlefield, and long after the war ended, that legacy continued to shape the destiny of a nation